All right, picking up the thread of the argument, we have a standard initial situation that puts the negotiations and agreements for rent in the context of standard buyer-seller transactions, ethics of egoism, and a free market political economic system. A counter-argument that says we need to make an exception in the case of some rental submarkets, particularly the rental markets for poorer tenants, because we believe that those lead to morally objectionable results. We have a different conception of the proper role of government power, and then a piece of legislation, rent control, that sets market prices, or overrides rather market prices, and sets prices on terms that are more beneficial to tenants and enable them to make a living. Now, the argument against rent control has a number of aspects to it, but I want to start by focusing on the economic aspects that are often raised by opponents of rent control. They will argue that while rent control is designed to help tenants, in fact, in the longer term, the medium to longer term, it is a destructive policy to all parties that are concerned. So what they will say is, let's imagine, right, or let's actually do the empirical case studies where rent control is put in place. So either there is no rent control and it is implemented, or the rent controls are increased in their severity in some respect. And so we'll just say rent control is added to the mix, right, in some degree. If we're going to do our economic analysis, we have to not take into account merely the short-term implications, which we think are going to be beneficial to tenants and harmful to landlords, but spin out the longer-term implications of rent control as a policy as it plays out, economically speaking. So what we then need to do is ask, how is this going to affect both sides of the equation? First side is the landlords. Obviously, the landlords, their profits are going to go down, right, as they are bringing in less money, and the tenants, by contrast, the other side of the equation, right, their costs, right, go down. They're paying less per month in rental units. Now then the question is going to be, how will these two parties change their behaviors given the differential economic impact of this policy upon them? People respond to incentives, and if my profits are going down, then for me as a landlord, I have different incentives, and I will act in accordance with them. And the same thing holds on the tenant side. Let's first take the landlord side of the equation and see how that works out. Well, landlords then might say, if my profits, right, immediately have gone down, and I think other things in the market are not going to change significantly over the next or over the foreseeable future, and I don't want my profits to go down or to continue to go down, what can I do to maintain my profits at levels that are desirable to me? So one thing that I can do is take a hard look at, for example, my maintenance budget. And what I can do is just start cutting various maintenance costs. Maybe I own an apartment building and I have cleaning crews come through and clean the halls and the common areas, say, twice a week. Well, maybe I will cut that back to once every other week and save a certain amount of money on my maintenance budget. In that case, the money that I would have spent on maintenance can go toward profits, and I am thereby happier. But the downside is that obviously the buildings then become less desirable, right? The quality of the rental space, right, is going down. So tenants are living in, say, dirtier places than they otherwise would be living in. Or another example might be if I'm a far-seeing landlord. I have a major investment in my apartment building. Suppose the apartment building has a tar shingle roof. Tar shingles on average last 15 to 20 years. And so I will know that every 15 to 20 years I'm going to be hit with a major expense of having to have the roof redone. So every year I'll set aside, if I'm smart, a certain amount of my income towards saving up so that by the time the 15 to 20 years rolls around, I've got enough money saved up to be able to pay for the roof being redone. Well, if my profits have gone down significantly, whatever money I've saved up in order to have the roof redone, I might just divert some of that money out of my savings for maintenance and into my profit sector. But what that means is that when the roof does need to be redone, I, as a landlord, won't have the money available to do the roof. And so I might look at the roof and say, it really needs to be redone, but I don't have the money for it. Let's see if I can get another year or 2 years out of the roof. But then, of course, some bad storm comes through, water leaks into the building, then I do have to get the roof redone, but water has gotten in, some of the wood starts to rot, and so the building's quality is going to go down and it's going to wear out, right, more quickly. Or another example might be, suppose you are my tenant and I'm the landlord, you're having a party some Saturday night, and the toilet goes out, and that's kind of unpleasant, so you give me a call and you say the toilet has gone out, we need to get it fixed. Well, if my profits have gone down significantly, is the likelihood that I, as a landlord, am going to call a plumber out on Saturday night and pay that guy double time in order to get your toilet fixed on Saturday night? I will probably say, oh yeah, I'll get someone out as soon as possible, but my incentive certainly is not to give you good customer service in that particular case because it's too expensive to me. I might then say, well, maybe I'll get the guy out during the week sometime, or if my profits really are very low, I might say, well, I'll just blow it off, in which case the tenant is going to be forced to pay for his or her own maintenance costs. Of course, what happens then is if I don't get your toilet fixed for you, well, you have to live in the place, so you're going to pay for the plumber to come and get your toilet fixed so you can actually use it. But then the next time you owe me rent, what you will do is you'll give me a check and you'll give me the bill that comes from the plumber, and your check will be less the amount that you had to pay for the plumber. And you'll say, there, I think we're square. I, as the landlord, I'm going to say, no, that is not acceptable. You owe me a certain amount. And so what's going to happen is the landlord-tenant relationships are going to become more soured. You're not happy as a tenant with the quality of the service. You're not happy with the quality of the buildings that you're living in, but you are paying, right, lesser rent. All right, so the quality goes down. If we project this into the future, buildings that are not well maintained right over time will wear out more quickly. So what we will have then is the building inspector coming around, and at a certain point, we'll just condemn the building and say this is no longer quality housing fit for humans to live in. And so buildings that may have lasted, say, 100 years, if they were well maintained, will be worn out and unlivable after, say, 50 years. And so this is then a generation or two into the initial effect. Okay, what else is going to happen if we go back to the initial sell? Landlords might cut the maintenance budget, but there are various other things that will happen. One thing that landlords will do is to say, well, my profits are not very high here, or are not as high as I would like them to be. Maybe I own this $10 million apartment building, and I was making 10% profit levels before rent control. Now rent control has come in, and say I'm only making 3% in profits. Now I'm still making 3% profits, but 3% is not 10%. And I might then say to myself, well, what happens if I sell my $10 million apartment building and I take that $10 million and invest in something else at a higher rate of return? Maybe I buy a franchise for a fast food restaurant, or I invest in gold, right? Or I invest in commercial real estate, right? Or I do any number of other things that, when I survey the business landscape, offers me higher profits. And so what happens here is that a significant number of landlords will try to sell, right, their property. Now, if you have then a number of landlords putting their property available for sale, right, on the market at the same time, they see that rent control is coming, or they're reacting to the existence of rent control. What that is then going to do is reduce the property values, right? In order to sell, since there are more units that are on the market, landlords will have to put their property at a lower value just to get someone interested in taking it. And obviously, people who are considering buying the rental units, they're going to say, well, you know, at 10% return, profit-wise, I'm willing to pay this amount. But if the things are only earning 3 to 4%, then I'm only going to pay this amount. And so the property value is going to go down. Now, we can also say, if we follow this line over here, maintenance budgets go down, buildings quality goes down. That also means that the value of the properties is going to go down. So property values go down. This has any number of implications here. One, for example, is that tax base in a city is going to go down. Typically, taxes on real estate property are tied to the assessed property value. So if the property value goes down, then the cities will be earning less money from tax revenues. And that then means that the things that cities will typically use their tax monies for, such as paying for schools or paying for neighborhoods or paying for trash removal, street lights, road repairs, sidewalk repairs, and so forth, they'll have less money available for that. And what that then means is, particularly in the neighborhoods where there is rent control, if there's less tax income coming from those neighborhoods, those will be the first neighborhoods that get cuts when the city realizes that it has a budget crunch going on. And so this then will typically mean there will be neighborhood effects. Schools are not as nice, parks are not as nice, trash is piling up, and so forth. So what we have putting these two together is the creation of slums. Bad neighborhoods and bad buildings within neighborhoods. And so another consequence of the lowering of landlords' profits is that the amount of new investment, right, is going to decrease. At any given time, there are real estate developers who are looking at their options, looking at the low income or low rental portion of the real estate market might be attractive to some, and they might, absent rent control, be able to say, all right, if I put up an apartment building and rent it out to the lower end of the economic bracket, I can say make 10% returns, but with rent control, I'm only going to be making 3% returns. I'm just not going to build that building. Instead, I will build some condos or go into commercial real estate, right, or something. So what also is going to happen is there will be less new investment that is less rental housing available in that particular market. Now, if we put these things together, and there are other things that are possible, of course, what we have is a net effect of the supply of rental housing, right, going down. So we have less investment, we have more buildings that are wearing out, and the quality of the buildings that are available is on average lower, and so we have a net negative, right, effect here. All right, so the net effect here is that the quality and the quantity of rental housing declines, right? And initially we said we had a situation of scarcity in cities like New York or San Francisco, high demand, right, low supply for various reasons. Rent control then is on the supply side, lowering the supply and so making the scarcity that much worse. Now let's consider the other side of the equation, the demand side of the equation. Rent control comes into place. The costs to the tenants therefore go down. So in the short run, tenants who have apartment buildings available to them are certainly happy about that. But how do tenants react as a result of the implementation of rent control? Well, standard economics is going to say that they will therefore increase their demand. Just take a working example. Suppose I'm a young person, I'm living in New York City, I've got my studio apartment, which is fine for me as a one person, but I'm paying $1,500 a month for that rental unit. That's a lot of money to pay for a studio apartment, but I am making it. Rent control comes in though, and suppose the rental price on my studio apartment is lowered to $1,000 a month. So my costs then have gone down $500 a month. Well, what do I do with that $500? Well, of course, there's lots of things that I could do with that $500. But one thing I might think about doing is increasing the size of my apartment. Because studio apartments, say, have gone from $1,500 a month down to $1,000 a month. But the cost of one-bedroom apartments has declined from $2,000 a month, say, down to $1,500 a month. And I was making it on $1,500 a month. So I might move out of my studio apartment and into a one-bedroom apartment. That's an increase in demand. And of course, the same thing is happening. People who are in one-bedroom apartments, some of them will say, I'm going to get a two-bedroom apartment. Then I'll have my bedroom and maybe I can have a home office or an entertainment room, right, or whatever. Or people with families where the kids are stacked up, right, in a room. They're in a three-bedroom apartment, but they've got several children. They might say, well, let's move to a four-bedroom apartment, and so on. Another way the demand will work is by attracting people who aren't already in that rental market to the rental market. So, for example, I often think of young people who are living in New Jersey, say across the river from Manhattan. And if you're a young person living in New Jersey has lots of attractions to it, but maybe you just graduated from high school and you're living with your mom and dad. And what you really want to do is you want to move out of your mom and dad's house and you want to move into the big city because that's where all of the action is. But without rent control, the prices in the big city are very expensive. And so you can't afford it. And so you stay living with mom and dad. You can't afford the $1,500 a month for that studio apartment. But rent control comes into place. The price of studio apartments drops from $1,500 a month down to $1,000 a month. Some of those kids in New Jersey are going to say, hey, I can swing $1,000 a month, so they'll move out of their mom and dad's house and move into the big city. That will be an increase in demand. Another example has to occur, or occurs rather, with respect to people who are currently living in more space than typically they need, and how the advent of rent control changes their incentives with respect to moving out of larger places and into smaller places. So a standard example here is to think of a little old lady. Sadly, her husband has died, and so she's living alone. The children they raised have all grown up and moved away, and maybe she's living in a large 10-room apartment in Manhattan, but it's a rent-controlled apartment, and so she looks at the options. Well, I don't necessarily need all of this space, and I'm not using all of this space, so many of the rooms are now empty, but if I move out of my rent-controlled apartment and say I have to move into a non-rent-controlled apartment, well, I'm going to be paying this huge increase in the amount of rent. So I'm just going to stay in my 10-room apartment. So what that then means is she is demanding, right, so to speak, or using more rental space than she otherwise would need. Without rent control, she would be looking at saying, man, I'm paying for this 10-bedroom apartment. It's very expensive. In order to save some money, I'm going to move out of it and move into a smaller place that's more affordable to me. And then that, of course, would free up a 10-bedroom apartment for another young family that is starting along. All right, so what we have then is an increase in demand combined with a decrease in supply. And if we put those two together, what we have is an increase in scarcity. Right, for various reasons, right, landlords are less inclined to make rental housing available in that market segment. It's much more attractive to people in that market segment, and so the scarcity has increased. Now, advocates of rent control, opponents of rent control will argue often that this is another example of unintended consequences. What we have is an intended consequence. What we're trying to do in the case of rent control is take a situation of scarcity and make the situation of scarcity less troublesome. But in this case here, we've enacted a policy that through various economic channels makes the scarcity worse. So the problem that we're trying to solve is being worsened by the proposed remedy. We could also argue that the unintended consequence is twofold in that what we're trying to do is help tenants. And certainly we do help some tenants in the short term by lowering their costs. But to the extent that we increase scarcity, we're making it more and more difficult for poorer tenants to find quality housing or even minimally quality housing available in any quantity because the scarcity is much worse. So they're either living in slums, right, or those buildings are wear out and they're condemned. Those poor people then in some cases don't have anywhere to go, so there may be increases in homelessness and so forth. Now, a couple of darker unintended consequences that we can put on the board here, work them into the flow chart. I say darker because another unintended consequence is a moral hazard, that what rent control does as these things play out is give people an incentive to act in various immoral and illegal ways and so forth. So if we think, for example, of a landlord. Suppose you started off, your profits went down, you didn't sell, you did cut your maintenance budget, Your property values are going down, and nobody wants to buy your lousy apartment building. Your relationships with your tenants has gone down, and so you're now a slumlord. And you've got now a piece of property that's not worth very much, and you're not making really any money for it, but you, of course, still have to pay your taxes, albeit lower taxes. What might you do if you are a slightly unscrupulous landlord? Well, one thing you might do is, of course, make sure that you continue to pay for your fire insurance bills to keep your premiums and policies in place. And then when things get bad enough, just torch the place. And so what typically happens as slums get worse and worse is the incidence of arson increases. Now, some of it, of course, is just people just liking to burn things and so forth, and so they look for easy targets and so forth. But a certain amount of it is landlords trying to recoup some of their investment. So if I can burn the place down and I can make sure that it doesn't look like arson, then I can collect from my insurance company. And this is an immoral thing to do, obviously destructive to anybody who's in the neighborhood and dangerous to them, but it also has the effect of accelerating the rate at which the supply decreases. We could say the same thing might occur over on the demand side. Suppose we go back to the example of the little old lady. Well, suppose eventually the little old lady dies, and you are the child of the little old lady. What you might decide to do is say, well, I'm not going to let anybody know that my mom has died, because I now then am in possession of the lease. I've got a 10-bedroom apartment available in Manhattan. Maybe I'll let the landlord know, or maybe I won't, but we certainly won't let the rent control board know that there's now an apartment available. Instead, what I might do is just have the word be circulated among my friends and so forth that there's a 10-bedroom apartment available in Manhattan, and let the bidding begin. So what I can then do is, even if I'm not living in New York City, say I'm living in Chicago, right, or whatever, I can sublease out this apartment to someone who can afford to pay various black market prices, right? Or the landlord, of course, might get involved in on this as well. Suppose the little old lady doesn't have any children and no other family members, but he knows the little old lady dies. The landlord then might say, okay, I'll clear her stuff out. I won't let the rent control board know. I'll just keep her name on the official lease, but then I'll let it be known that there's an apartment available, and anybody who can afford to pay a much higher price than the rent control price, I will rent it out to that person. So what that then means is there is an incentive for the development of a black market. That is to say, housing on the legal market declines, and properties and rental units get shifted over to the black market. Now, in the black market, who can afford to pay black market prices? Well, obviously, poorer people are less likely to pay black market prices. People who are more prosperous are going to be able to pay black market prices. There's going to be lots of corruption, right, that goes on here. It's going to depend on who knows whom and so forth. And so every year or so, there's always a scandal or two in rent-controlled areas where supermodels or politicians who are connected in various ways, it turns out that they have any number of apartments scattered around the world in rent-controlled districts, and they got them not because they are poor people who needed them, but rather because they had the right kinds of connections and they could pay the black market price. Now, to the extent then that property is shifted off the legal market and into the black market, that is another unintended consequence, but it's an unintended consequence that makes the scarcity worse. All right, so to summarize, this side will say, having done its economic analysis against rent control, that in summary, if we look at the net effects of rent control on the two major parties who are involved, the landlords lose. Right? Their profits go down, right, or they're forced out of the business into some other business, or they end up being slumlords or owners of properties that have lower economic value. So it's not a gain for landlords, and that's certainly part of the intended effect of rent control. But the surprising conclusion that is reached by this side of the argument is that it's also a lose for tenants, particularly the tenants that rent control is designed to help. Tenants find it harder, right, given this increased scarcity to find available housing, and the housing that they might actually find available is typically going to be much lower standard than they otherwise would. So we end up with a lose-lose transaction. And that's a sign of a bad policy if it harms everybody involved.